Let's test your cable. See if it's your charger, and then must be a battery here. Why? It just turned off. She said no. It says it's charged, so.
Did you want to, like, there are plugs back here. If you have a longer charger, I can string it in here. But oh dear, that's disconcerting.
Just gave up on you. I got it like literally 2020. Because like I had a MacBook Air that like overheated and then like fried the thing.
That's Apple's 3 years. Like, no, it's time for you to buy a new device thing. Yeah.
Well, have you tried holding it down?
Okay. Oh, I guess I just switched that over. You can watch it twice. Yay. Okay. Let's get started here. Okay. So today, we definitely have like stuff to go forward on talking about research design. Before I kind of jump into that, I had talked about kind of looking through the first major lab with you today. I'm just not sure, and I'll leave it up to you to decide. Is that too early? Like, I know it's not due for a while. I think October 18th. Is it too early for me to kind of go through it with you? You're not. It's not too early. I get like some yeses and some nos. Because I mean, I can go over it again, like as we get closer to it. But because the idea, behind doing the mini labs is that you're sort of building the pieces of the major lab, and you then just kind of, fix them with the feedback I gave you, and then slot them in. And like some of them you have to build out, right? Like for the survey question portion, you write, I think, 5 survey questions for the mini lab, and then I think it's like 10 or 15 that I want for the major lab. So I just want to know, like, if it's too early, we can leave it for a bit. Like, I know October 18th is a long time away, but I do want you sort of to like think. The goal is like the major lab should be pretty easy to put together at the end, because you've already done the work as you work through. So how do you guys want to do it today? Okay, we'll go through it really quick. I might have to play it because I always record everything and put it on, so I might have to play around a little bit with OBS, and because I'm working on a single monitor, which I'm not usually. If I was doing this from home, I could do it much more seamlessly. Okay, let's just look at that. I'm gonna blow, too big. Okay, no, that should be okay. I always have my stuff on black backgrounds, so it's easier on the eyes. And I'm just gonna switch the window capture to that. Okay, perfect. Yay. I know how technology works. I'm really smart. Okay. So the major lab, right? So, or lab assignment 1. Okay. So basically what this amounts to is you're going to put together, a quantitative research proposal and say, like, I don't know, you're thinking about putting it forward for funding, or you're applying to grad school and you need to propose a project, right? You're going to kind of put it together kind of like that. Okay, so First part, really straightforward, an explanation of your research project in writing, right? So you have to write it up. That includes your research question and an explanation of why you think the project is important, right? So that's pretty straightforward, right? The big part of that is sort of what you were working on in the lab Tuesday and Wednesday, and then what you're doing for mini lab 1, which is the research question. But then, an explanation, and again, try to do it in layman's terms, right? Try to be non-jargony about it, and why you think it's important. So I think that's pretty straightforward. I think the whole assignment is actually pretty straightforward. A proposal for how you'll conduct your research. Because we're quantitative, right? And we'll come to this, like we're going to talk about how you do this in principle. Define the concepts that are most important to your research study, right? So what concepts are you going to be using? And then define, you need to explain how you'll operationalize the research and justify why the method you're choosing will be the best for getting the information, right? So if you're gonna do a survey, you have to say, okay, these are what we're gonna be measuring with the survey. These are the variables. This is how I'm gonna operationalize them. And again, don't worry about that just for right this moment. We're gonna get to that probably next week. Provide nominal and operational definitions of each variable. Again, we haven't gotten there, but it's pretty straightforward. The third one, this is absolutely super easy. Barely an inconvenience. Why? Because I gave you a template and all you kind of have to do is fill it out without, changing too much. And it's included in one of the labs and it's included with all the documents for the major lab assignment. But it's an information and consent letter. This has to do with ethics, right? So you kind of have to, the idea there is you're trying to think through, any ethical problems, any risks that might be associated to the people who are engaged in your research project, and how you would mitigate them and these sorts of things, right? So you have to kind of do that. Okay, a sample of your research materials. So this is the one that I think is probably the most important, right? A sample of your research materials. So here, right, minimum 10 questions. Or are you doing structured observation, description? I'm gonna, I said don't do operational design, so strike don't do experimental design because I told you not to, and maybe I'll revise that and just take it out or put a big red line through it because I don't want you doing that because it doesn't really work that well. But yeah, research materials. Now the word count there is it doesn't work if you do survey questions because survey questions sometimes end up being longer depending on your answer options, but we can talk about that when we get to it. But yeah, you'd have to have at least 10 survey questions, and I'll tell you verbally because I sort of laid it out on the mini lab for that section. No demographic questions, right? So if you ask questions like, how old are you? Are you male or female? How much money do you make? That I'm not, because those are too easy. You're not really writing those questions. They write themselves. And then provide an explanation of what kind of sampling method and size you will be using. And we'll talk about sampling method, like probability sampling in the class, but you need to figure out, and I'll give you a formula, and all you have to do is plug in the numbers. It's even a website, honestly. You just have to go and plug in the numbers and figure out, how big of a sample size you need, depending on what you want to get out of it. But yeah, you need to kind of write down, in a page or less, an explanation of your sampling method. So it's really, really, I think this is a really straightforward assignment. I think. How do you feel about that? Any questions? Yeah. I can give you examples if those are helpful. I have tons of examples actually, because I never delete any student assignments, and electronic submission allows me to keep them forever. But I'll take all the identifying information out. So yes, I can give you an example of what a successful one looks like. I'll see if I can find one that Joe did the comments for. Joe was my TA 2 years ago. And he was just the meanest. The only TA I've ever had to go through and actually edit his comments before I gave them back to students because he was so blunt. It was like, this is stupid. I'm like, okay, can you think of a better way to say that? Anyway, so I will never do that to you but I always found Joe really funny for that because he was just so blunt. So blunt at the best of times. Okay, other questions? Yeah.
Just for the mini lab, do
Okay, so that is like 2 mini labs forward. Yeah, so we're gonna do survey question design because I have not taught you how to do a survey question, and it is hard to do properly. But writing a bad survey question is surprisingly easy. Writing a good survey question is hard. So you don't need to do it yet until we get there, right? For this week, I just want your research question. And that is due at midnight on Sunday, by the way. And I will try to turn that around in the fastest order that I possibly can to get it back to you before the second lab if I can. But it's a quick turnaround, but I'll do what I can. Other questions? Okay, and we can look at this again before. But what I do actually want to do very quickly is look at the rubric. I know rubrics are exciting. They aren't. But kind of important nonetheless. Because I think sometimes people don't pay attention to them. And I'm just going to switch this again so it records properly. There we go. I love OBS. It's so beautiful. Okay. So, sorry, I guess if I pull this up a little bit, you can see basically the way this is scored, right, is these 2 sections, right, at the top are scored out of 5, but they're multiplied by 2, right? So those are heavily weighted sections. This one, effectiveness of the information letter, because it's an easy task, right, it's out of 5, and it's not double weighted, it's a single weight. And then, research materials, again, so that's why I said in class or in the lab, if you were there, that surveys are the way to go with this part, because it's heavily weighted, and other research tools are quite hard to write properly at the level you're at. As you get better at this, as you go on and do research, you get better at it. But for intro to social methods, I'd suggest sticking to it. That's double weighted. And then the last one, when you talk about your sampling method, it's a single weight again, right? So relatively much less important than the other portions. Okay. So highlighting weird stuff, but nevertheless. Okay, so the research question, I'm marking the effectiveness of the ideas and the quality of the elements of the assignment. Okay, so the research question for excellent, right? The research question and the explanation need to be insightful, carefully considered, critical engagement, and with understanding how research questions and methods are related, right? So if you have a research question that really, is well written and it works really well in terms of setting up that methodology, right? And if you remember from I won't double flip on the recording, right? Research question and why you think it's important, right? This first section, when you write the research question, it should be pretty clear how it relates to the methodology, right? And it's smart, like it's smartly written, right? It shows real effort into kind of getting the details of a research question right. So excellent, it's not impossible to get. I give excellence all the time. So for proficient, right, you've active engagement, right? You've tried, but there's, how research and methods are related, and basically like everything makes sense, but it's not like, there's not a really, it's hard because all this is very subjective. There's not like a wow factor. Everything works, but maybe that thought of how this whole project is going to look is a little bit less developed than here. At satisfactory, and I almost always tend like kind of in here to the upper range of here. I'll give half marks as well, right? So 5.5. No, I don't do that, but I give half marks and 3/4 marks and all sorts of things depending. So you could be at like a 4.75 if I think you're like very close to here, but not quite. I do all that sort of stuff. Okay, satisfactory, right? Your research question is straightforward. It's understandable. But it's, maybe the idea of what you're going to do is a little bit lacking. It's kind of generic, right? And you do get this because not everybody's into the content of this course, and sometimes you're rushed, right? So sometimes you might come up with something that's very generic, right? But kind of plausible. Okay, I almost never see these two, but I mean it happens now and then. Research question is bad, right? It's weak, and it's like, okay, how would this relate to a method? It's not necessarily clear, and the elements are incomplete or basic, right? Like, you've got 500 words to work it out, and you gave me like 2 sentences. That kind of falls into the limited category. And then poor, and like I said, I very, very seldom give a poor. Basically, you have to phone it in up to an incredible extent. Like, I won't even explain what's there, but it's like there was no effort put into this. You put this together 5 minutes before it was due, and it shows. That's like poor for me. Okay. Your plan for the research. Okay, really what's key here, right? So the research proposal, it's carefully considered, right? So when you say how you're going to do the research, it's carefully considered, and you have a great understanding of how you would do research. Sorry, are you in the back? Would you mind putting the arm of that desk next to you down? Because I keep seeing it in my peripheral vision, and it looks like someone has their hand up. And so I'm like, thank you, that's great. I'm like, someone has a question. Oh wait, that's just a desk for like the 4th time. I am the dog from Up, by the way. It's like, squirrel. Okay, so what's really important here, right, is going to be definitions and concepts, right? So you've precisely defined what you're going to be studying, and operationalization. You've really shown how you're going. Operationalization is just how you measure things, right, in quantitative research. So how are you, if you're looking at, say, something like religiosity, how are you going to measure religiosity? How have you turned that general concept into something that you can turn into numbers, right? So that it's like, yeah, great, amazing. You followed all the steps, and it's really good. At proficient, right, it's clear and understandable, right? There might be some, less defined and less kind of precise and clarity than there is here. And yeah, you've done a really good job explaining operationalization, and it's proficient, it works. There might be some flaws in it, but it's mostly pretty effective. Satisfactory, right? Again, everything is kind of adequately defined. There might be some flaws in the definition, but it shows real effort. And then the operationalization, it's satisfactory understanding of how you operationalize, but again, there might be some flaws and some gaps in how you've thought about it that would need to be addressed. And again, limited and poor, right? You've very oversimplified, and you're not trying, right? You just like threw something together. And then again, poor, I don't really give pours unless it's really deserved. Almost no one should get anything but this for this part, honestly. Because as long as all of the following elements are present and well explained, as long as you kind of follow the letter template, there's one in the textbook you can use too, or there's the one that I have given you as part of the assignment, and all of these parts are there, you get 5 out of 5, right? If you're missing like one of these, or like one of these, you'll get 4 out of 5. This should not happen. Just look at, before you submit it, just be like, do I have all of these things? Good. 5 out of 5. If one's missing, 4 out of 5. If 2 are missing, 3 out of 5. If somehow more than 3 are missing, you're going to end up in here. I've never seen it because it's so easy to do. Honestly, this is like 5 free marks. Follow the template. You win. Okay? Easy peasy. It's my gift to you. One of many, or one of few. I don't know. Okay. And again, this is all recorded, so you can refer back to that later. With the research materials, right? So you've avoided all major errors associated with their use, right? Like these are excellent. If you're writing survey questions, you've written basically perfectly, right? There are no real flaws, and they're all well tailored to finding the answer to your research question, right? So you don't have any stray questions that are like, well, that would help you find out something quite different, but it wouldn't really relate to your research question. Okay, here you have maybe a few minor errors, but mostly use of, say, survey questions is correct, or the other tool that you choose, and mostly works pretty well. You've got some satisfactory, good, but you've got some major problems. Maybe the question that you ask on the survey is good, but and don't worry, we'll talk about all this, but the answer possibilities that you give to people are a little bit lacking or bad. And so, and then some of the questions don't really answer your research question. You're unsatisfactory. You've screwed everything up. Nothing is right. No, you've got a lot of errors, and who knows how this is going to answer your question. And again, I don't really give that grade very often. So, but you've basically for poor, you've really, really, really phoned it in, right? Okay. And the last category, the sampling. So you're choosing your sampling method. Like, how are you going to get the data? How many people are you going to look at? What circumstances are you going to, how many cases or whatever. Right, so your sampling method is appropriate, right? Good. You've chosen the correct one, and your explanation shows that you understand how, why, that sampling method would be the right one. Again, here, it's appropriate. You've chosen the right sampling method, but your understanding of why that's the number you'd need is a little bit lacking, or the kind of sampling you need. Here, again, a little bit less. It's you've mostly chosen the right sampling method. Maybe there's something a little bit off. Satisfactory understanding, not perfect. And again, limited and poor. That happens actually more in this category, where sometimes, people will choose something absolutely insane. I'll give, just as an example, people would be like, I'm going to send out a survey to 1 million people. It's impossible. You can't ever get a survey done by 1 million people. And so it's you've missed it, and that shows that you have a weak understanding, right? Okay, so that is basically what that assignment looks like. That's how it's going to be graded. Typically, I also give some comments, but because I think it's a pretty detailed rubric, I don't usually give a ton. Any questions about any of that? Yeah.
While we're working on the lab assignment, are we allowed to ask questions?
Of course you are. Why not? Of course, I'm here to help you. And I mean, you can book usually after class, I'm pretty free. On Tuesday, Thursday, you can also book office hours times with me. But I'm happy to take a look as you're working on it and give you some pointers. You will be getting lots of feedback along the way too on the mini lab assignments. So if we have something concrete that you have, I can definitely take a look at it.
So for the research question, how imaginative and original does it have to be? Is it okay if it's something I've definitely read some kind of study or on this before? Is it okay to use a research question that we definitely know someone's done before?
As long as don't plagiarize, obviously, but you can take. I'd say try to take a beat on it. Come up with a take on it, and if it's a really interesting one, you've seen someone do a really interesting project that you think would be interesting to look into, or an aspect of it, sure. If you're doing that though, don't make it super generic, right? Because there is a lot of research out there that can be very kind of generic, right? And actually not what kind of insight is it going to give people, right? So does that make sense?
I don't really know what you mean by generic.
Oh, I'm trying to think of an example. Let me just think here for half a second. I'm thinking of something what's the link between social media, time spent on social media, and body image, right? That's something that's been done to death, right? It's one of these copy paste kind of I'm sorry if that's what you're hoping to do. I've read that proposal 1,000 times and I'm bored of it. But that's to me seems like a very generic, it's been done a lot. So it's it has a bunch of inherent flaws too, which is why I also wouldn't suggest doing it. But something like that where you've seen a ton of it, if you find something that's, I guess what's the point of the assignment is for you to think what kind of research you would be interested in doing, and then how do you formulate that research question rather than just taking someone's. How do you turn the variables that you want to measure, or turn the concepts you want to measure into variables, right? So I don't want you to just like port someone else's work and just copy like their survey. That'd be pretty hard anyway, because a lot of times people don't make their survey questions available. But yeah, if there's something that you're kind of interested in, and then you want to think through like, okay, how would you do the research? I'm okay with that. Yeah, and explaining why it's interesting is going to be then where the grades come in. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay, sampling methods, like how do we know how many people do it?
I will tell you that later in the course. We're going to get to that. There are formulas, and I have it. It's built in somewhere in the course. I just have to find it again. Like there's like online calculators too, but it all depends on stuff like how big your population is, right? How much of a margin of error do you want in your sample, right? Because the bigger your sample size, the smaller your margin of error, the more difficult, but it's harder to get a big sample size, right? So it's going to depend on, you know, your confidence ratios and all of that. But like I said, we'll get to that, and trust me, I'm not going to just be like, do it without explaining it to you. And unfortunately, it is a methods class, excruciating detail. Other questions? Did you? It's alive! Huzzah! Okay. All right. Yeah, please.
We want to research something that like it's like kind of personal. Is that okay? Like I don't know how to explain it, but like something
Maybe
that relates to our life.
Maybe come talk to me, especially for that might work better for like. It depends what it is. It might work better for qualitative because this portion is and you can do it in the second half of the course because we're going to get to that. Because this is quantitative, things that are personally interesting might be hard to research, which is where, you know, in formulating your research question and thinking about how you'd measure it, hopefully we kind of figure out whether it's doable. But you can come and ask me and I can be like, maybe later or not. Yeah.
For the mini lab, for one of the questions you're asking if you can be like research scientifically, does that mean like you can Google it, or that can be like reproduced?
Is Google science? No, I'm kidding.
Like Google Scholar?
Like, can you put it into, like, essentially, can it be measured empirically, right? So is there a way that you could use, you know, kind of the observational and, you know, like that more positivist epistemology to study it, right? So is it susceptible to, say, empirical observation, or is it a phenomenon that's very kind of personal and social, right? In that case, you think like, well, could I do this in such a way that it would be A, reproducible, that it would be B, kind of, you know, quantifiable in ways, measurable, right? Those are the things you want to think about in terms of scientifically. Because then you have a lot of social phenomenon, like, you know, what is it like to be a furry, which isn't necessarily, sorry, he's shaking his head, but isn't susceptible necessarily to quantification, right? Or to empirical study. You're going to hear so many furry examples. I don't know why. Okay, how are we doing? Good? I know this is long. I don't know how long. Half an hour. But hopefully, like, I really want to do this now because I really think, like, one of the big errors I always see is people don't read the rubric. They don't think how they're going to write the assignment through the rubric, but the rubric is there to tell you how you're going to be graded. And the reason I give it to you so far in advance is A, because I have it, because I've taught this class many times, and B, so that you can kind of use the rubric to guide how you're putting it together. So as you're putting it together, and even as you're doing the mini labs, which, like, you know, this week's involves, you know, the research question, you can be thinking about, like, I'm not going to grade you in this way on the mini lab, obviously, because I said it's pass fail, but you can be thinking about, like, where do I think I sit here? And then when you get my feedback, you know, we can talk about how do you go from, I don't know, you started here, you want to end up here. How can you do that, right? So hopefully this is helpful. If not, I just wasted a half hour of everyone's time. And we can talk about this again as we get, like, right close to the due date. I can even come into the beginning of one of the labs so we don't have to use class time to do it. We'll waste Celine's time instead. She's being paid. And so, yeah, we can kind of think through that again as we get closer to it, but I wanted you to have a chance to think about it before. All right, last chance for questions before I move in. Oh, 2 more. Yay.
Sorry if this is redundant. I missed the
we're wanting to build on for the bigger lab. Is that
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So you don't have to,
Yeah.
right? Like if you get feedback from me, after the mini lab and you're like, man, that didn't work, you can scrap it and restart. But my idea is that and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, is that it builds, right? You build them on the mini labs to get to the major labs so that by the time you get there, you're just plopping in pieces and like fleshing them out a bit. And it's not like, on October 17th, which I'm certain none of you are going, or the morning of October 18th, you're not like, I should really start thinking about this assignment. You've been thinking about it the whole semester. That's my goal. Was it you? Yes.
When you said like scientific, does that mean like it can be replicated by a researcher and you would get the same results of that?
So sometimes when you think about replicability in the social realm, is that the tool set could be used. Okay, yes, it could be used to measure things at, say, a future point and then compare it, right? So like, think of something like, that's a longitudinal design rather than a cross-sectional one. But let's say that okay, there was this very famous study, I've got it in my head now, done in 1979 of American scientists, and they wanted to know, what their opinion was of kind of religion and God. So they asked them a bunch of questions about their religious beliefs, and then 20 years later, in 1999, someone took that same set of questions and went back to different scientists and asked them the same questions and said, okay, now we can compare, we've used the same questions at different points in time. Now we can compare kind of what scientists thought then and what scientists think now, right? So that's kind of scientific, right? You can use that same tool set to compare like past and present, or past. Well, I guess you can't compare the future. Past and present is the best you can do, or multiple points, right? You could do multiple cross sections. Longitudinal design, right? Like, are you going to be measuring the same things all along? So if you say are asking survey questions from 1979 to 2023, can you ask these same questions all the way along and get the same measurements at different points in history, right? Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay. But yeah, I mean, are you turning something that's kind of measurable empirically is especially the important thing. And yeah, if someone else took the same tool set, would they, and moved it, say, to a different context or the same context, would they be likely to get the same kinds of results, right? Would they at least be measuring the same things? Does that make sense? Okay. Last chance, and then we're going to get into the very fun world of whatever it is we're talking about. We're good? Okay. Back to the slides. And sorry, I have to switch OBS back. Promise we won't do this all the time. Is that? Yes, okay. Huzzah, the day is won. All right. So we were talking about validity at the end, and I usually do a review, but because I used all that time, I want to move forward on this. We were talking about validity last time. So we talked about internal validity, right? So that's, I think, where we ended off was internal validity. Are you correctly identifying the cause and effect relationship, right? To what extent is internal validity concerned with the extent to which what is interpreted as the cause of a phenomenon is actually what's producing it? So are you measuring the right cause in the cause and effect, or is there a spurious kind of relationship? Okay. Measurement validity, a little bit different. But basically involves the question, are you measuring what you want to measure, right? So, the example, I think this is from the textbook, is the number of murders recorded in annual police statistics a valid indicator of the murder rate, right? So are you, basically, if you're saying like, okay, we're going to measure murders by what's reported in, say, uniform crime statistics, right? Is that going to be the best way of measuring how many murders actually take place? Or are you measuring, kind of officially recorded murders or officially recorded deaths, only, within the kind of realm that the police kind of define them? Is there, is there another way of measuring that would be better, right? Okay, so I'll give you another example. Let's say you're trying to measure religiosity, right? This is a hard one, but I know it well. You're wanting to measure how religious people are, right? And you wanted to, like, and what you took as a record was, or how you tried to measure it rather, is how many times people report attending religious services, right? So, and you could have it, weekly plus, weekly, several times a month, several times a year, seldom never, right? Would maybe be the ways that you measure it. Would that be a valid way of measuring religiosity, right? So in this case, like, does it capture all of the aspects of what potentially it means to be a religious person, right? Just whether you attend religious services or not. Now, why would that potentially not work from the perspective of measurement validity? Like, are you actually measuring religiosity by how often people attend religious services? Well, you could, of course, have private religious practices, right? In which case, you might want to either include or swap out something like a measure of religious salience, right? How important is religion in your daily life might be a better measure of religiosity. Yeah, go ahead.
For the example of murders reported, if you're only measuring like what's reported and like numbers that aren't, like how do you get past
Well, okay, it's a good question. There might be so police might, report certain things as murder. There might be like suspicious deaths or unexplained deaths, say that come in through the coroner's office, that might not be included in the murder statistics for whatever reasons, that you might be like, actually, I want to include, there's these deaths that are simply not explained, or people who disappear, right? And maybe their bodies are never found. Should we include some of that in the number of murders, right? Like romantic partners who randomly disappear and are never heard from again. Should we include that in murder statistics? So is only what like the police measure in terms of, like, I think actually police reports would probably be your safest metric, but you have to still think about it as you're kind of asking the question. Would that encompass all the kind of possibilities of what murders are? Yeah.
police report to get the missing person?
It could be, yeah, definitely. You'd be still probably relying on crime statistics in that particular example. So yeah, I mean, or coroner's reports, right? Maybe you're looking at stuff out of the coroner's office. It's less about like, is this the perfect way of recording it? And I'm not saying it's not, but you want to think about, are you actually measuring what you want to measure? Or is there, are you just measuring kind of official kind of statistic ways or police understandings of murder, or is there something else that this question is measuring? This is why I also switched to a question about religiosity, because I'm like, feel much, there's a lot of other ways that it works, say, talking about religiosity. This example, it's not the richest one. I took it out of the textbook, and now I'm like, my imagination has better answers than that. Sorry, does that make sense? Or does it kind of, have I made sense, or are you unclear about measurement validity, right? Because there could be different ways. You might think you're measuring something using one kind of measure, right? Like how religious are people by how often they attend religious services. But what about, I don't know, people who consider themselves religious, but maybe don't attend religious services, or religions where weekly attendance isn't actually part of the religion, right? You'd say, if you're talking about just religious service attendance, you might actively exclude Buddhists, Sikhs, and Hindus, right? Because there isn't like as big of a go to religious service every week. So are you measuring there what you want to measure? Are we good? Oh yeah.
Could you kind of like bypass that by like defining what you mean by religious beforehand and add like specific criteria? What someone needs in order to be religious?
Yes, but that would affect the kind of question you're at. Like, that would affect how you measure it, right? So like if you have, your definition of religious is, say, someone who reports high religious salience and a high number of religious practices within a week, then yeah, you've already kind of done this work, because you're like, well, religious service attendance, that's not a good measure. but how important they say religion is to them and how often they do religious-y type things. I don't like pray or read sacred books. That's a better measure, right? So you're kind of like, you've already kind of, if you're doing what you say, you've already kind of jumped into, my definition of religion means I'm thinking about how to measure it, right? And you've already kind of thought about what's the best way of measuring based on my definition of religion. Does that make sense? Okay.
Because religion is very hard to define. Like, will that give you
I
problems?
disagree with that notion. I have done an entire 6 lectures on how to define. No, we're in sociology of religion. We're in lecture number 3 about what is religion and how to define religion. Yeah, you definitely have to have a good definition, right? But so murder is probably easier to, someone has been made unalived by someone else. It's easier to define. Nevertheless, whatever your definition is, right, you want to make sure that then you're measuring the right thing, right? Hand up, no? No, okay. Just adjusting your leaning hand. Other questions?
For our lab assignment, when we talking about like something like if we're talking about religion, do we have to include multiple definitions or just the one?
No. Don't think your definition. Do not include multiple, because then it's going to get very confusing, right? You're going to want to focus in on one definition. Otherwise, you're like, this also could be a definition, because then I'm going to read it and be like, well, which one and why this one, not that one? So just give, if you're, or even I don't know, social media addiction. Your definition of social media addiction, right? Someone who uses social media more than 5 hours a day, right? Not, don't give me multiple definitions. That would be very confusing. Other questions? Are you good with that? You're good? Okay. And you're good with my explanation? Oh, no, you're not.
Just to clarify,
Very good.
you can give your own definition and say that's what you're studying, even if maybe critics would disagree with that definition.
But you're going to have to justify it. And you're going to have to say, right, because when we get to operationalization, you're going to have to talk about how you're going to operationalize that definition. But yes, you can have your own definition of things, right? That isn't like a shared one. It just has to make sense. It has to make sense. Yes, of course it does. And you're going to have to justify why that definition then kind of flows out into things that are going to measure validly what you're trying to measure. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. It's a lot more questions on measurement validity than I thought I'd get. I wasn't sure if that was a tentative question or not.
So if you were to do a survey kind of questionnaire for how religious a person is, could you use both how often they attend their church, how often they read sacred books, how strong they feel connection to God, all to meet how religious they are?
That's how I would do it. So you've now ventured into the 3 Bs, which is belief, belonging, and behavior, which is typically how sociologists of religion measure religiosity, right? So yeah, what do they believe? How sure are you about the existence of God, right? How do they behave, right? Prayer, religious service attendance, sacred book reading, other attendance at para-religious activity, all of that stuff you can include. And then belonging, do they identify as part of a particular group, right? Which is your standard, are you a Roman Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, Sikh, right? All those things. Does that make sense? Was that a question or were you stretching? Okay, cool. It looked like doing the wave, so I wasn't sure. Any others? Is there a lot of questions on measurement validity, which is all good. All right, let's move on. We could cover at least 3 slides today, people. I swear. I see. I did this because I freaked you out in the beginning by talking about your assignment, and now you want a lot of detail. Okay, so external validity, right? External validity. 2 primary concerns when it comes to external validity. Are the findings applicable to situations outside the research environment, and can the findings be generalized beyond the people or cases studied? Now, not having external validity isn't necessarily the end of the world, right? there are a lot of studies and there's a lot of sociological research that you're not gonna be able to say has external validity, right? That you've looked at, say, a very specific case, and beyond that case, you can't generalize anything beyond that, right? So, let's say you're doing if you're doing a survey, right? So let's talk about our make-believe religious survey, right? You're wanting to know about the religious beliefs of Canadians, right? And so you survey 4,000 Canadians, across Canada. So really, really big sample size, and you see that, nothing in particular, people who are, say that they have no religion, is about 35% of the Canadian population. And you could say, right, I've got a big enough sample, right, and the methodology is empirical enough that I feel pretty safe saying that, this is a portrait of the Canadian population as a whole, right? Or if you're doing a survey of people in Edmonton, right, you do 1,500 surveys, on attitudes about, or people's attitudes about the LRT, right? You can generalize that out to then the whole population because you've got a big enough sample, right? And the way that you're approaching the question is going to mean you have like high external validity, right? So you could apply it outside of just the people that you surveyed. Yeah, or I guess that number two. Would it be applicable like outside of, the specific situation or research environment, right? Again, is something, I'm trying to think where that would be. Like in a lab study, right, or an experimental design, could you generalize outside of that situation? Outside of just the research environment you created, do you think that what you found, right, that people will shock other people or harm other people if they feel like someone is telling them to do it, right? Could you apply that outside the research environment? A little bit less applicable in some sense in social research, right? Because, sometimes social research is, social, so it involves the whole society. But I guess even if you were like studying like a subculture, right, and you found that the Hells Angels have this particular kind of cultural way of, engaging with their members and locking people into long-term commitments, could you externalize that to other subcultures, right? Or is it only, the Hells Angels, are they a particular subculture that you wouldn't want to kind of externalize, right? So can you take what you find, right? Once a Hells Angel, always a Hells Angel, and externalize it to other scenarios outside your particular kind of case. And yeah, is it generalizable? Can you put it to a whole population level typically, right? And this is, for quantitative research primarily. Most qualitative research is not going to be generalizable, and that's okay, right? You would just have to say, like, this is the case here. These things might carry over to other scenarios and other things won't. Sorry, does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so yeah, Cook and Campbell, again, with these cats, outline some threats to external validity, representativeness of study participants, the findings might not be generalizable to a wide variety of people not included in the experiment, right? Like, so if it's not really randomized, right? If you don't have a representative sample, it'll apply only to, the kind of population you studied. The findings might not apply to settings and environment different from those in the experiment. I kind of already said that. Effects of pre-testing, again, they think pre-testing is a big thing. Findings might not apply to people who weren't pre-tested. Again, this is going to be in kind of experimental settings principally. And then reactive effects, again, this is going to be, you could have this in a few scenarios actually. Even say in qualitative, reactive effects could affect the experiment. So reactive effects, right, is when people try to people start acting differently because they know they're being studied, right? So, I mean, the very base one that you find kind of normally just out in the world, right, is you try to take a picture of your friends and that one friend always puts on a goofy face because they know that you're taking a picture, or if it's my 13-year-old daughter, you try to take a picture and she immediately starts scowling to look as angry as possible for whatever reason. Right, or it's a reactive effect, right? The experimental arrangement causes a reactive effect. Or, sometimes, I don't know, you would go to, say, I don't know, your fan convention, and people know that you're studying them, so they start to act differently than they normally would because they know they're being observed, right? And so, yeah, it can lower validity because people are reacting to your presence as a researcher and acting then in atypical ways. So you're not getting what you thought. Yeah.
What do you mean by pre-tested? People are not pre-tested.
Okay, so I mean, I talked about this last time. Typically, like when you're doing like a lab experiment, so more typical of psychology than sociology, you might do a pre-test to establish someone's baseline, right? So I gave the example of like when I was in undergrad, I participated in one of these Psych 107 experiments, go be experimented on by a grad student for 2% of your grade. And it was like solving math equations. And they would give you 5 math equations to solve. And then once you do those, they then give you 5 more, but then crank up like heavy metal music to see how you do under a more stressful environment. Or they keep coming in to check on you and be like, hey, how are you doing with those questions, to see like how interruptions would deal with things. Or, okay, another, they might have you do a series of tasks, they give you like 10 tasks to do, and then basically they see how you're doing them, and then they give you 10 more tasks, and but then they have like a phone pop up with notifications all the time, and see how that affects your kind of ability to do those tasks. The pre-test in some cases, like trying to establish what your baseline was, can actually affect the results, right? Because you might be more tired after doing those 10 math equations, or you're impatient, you just want to get out of there because you thought it was going to take less time. So sometimes the pretest actually affects kind of the results, and that can lower your validity, right? So if your pretest is set up in such a way that it biases the results, that will reduce your ability to make generalizations about the thing you were actually testing on. Make sense? Okay, perfect. Good? Okay. I can't believe we're almost out of time. Replicability. So replicability is a really big question in the social sciences. And there's a lot of debate about how important it is, but I think there's a pretty strong consensus that the social sciences, particularly psychology, but sociology is not immune from this either, are in the midst of a replicability or a replication crisis, right? So, I mean, for scientific testing, right, when we think of the scientific method, the idea with the scientific method was always that, if you publish your paper, on the mating habits of fruit flies in a certain environment in kind of biological science, right, someone could take your study kind of procedure, repeat it, and get the same results, right? And that's how science kind of verifies facts, right? In a lot of cases, this is what people have wanted in the social sciences, right? Because the social sciences have always wanted to be scientific, at least in some sense. So replicability, again, it's not the end of the world if your study isn't replicable, right? But it is something that increasingly people are worrying about, and especially in the social sciences, that nobody's even trying to replicate results. So sometimes, right, you get research studies that have really exotic results, and they're hard to replicate, so we can't actually kind of check whether those results are valid, right? And there's lots of cases where social science research would be actually pretty hard to replicate, especially on the qualitative level. So again, it's not the end of the world if something's not replicable, but it is something that, increasingly we are thinking about. I mean, would the tool set, if you used it, right, if you put out the same tool set, would it at least measure things in the same way? Like, are the procedures sound and spelled out correctly, right? So if someone took your kind of research methodology and repeated it, would they get kind of similar results? Would they be measuring the same things in a different kind of setting or environment, right? is there's some aspect of this that can be repeated to get similar results that would more or less confirm what you found, maybe with some caveats and some improvements, or is basically the way you've laid out the research so esoteric that it can't be replicated, right? And a lot of psychological research now is really, really hard to replicate. And so psychology, I know, is in a replication crisis. Also, because there's the other thing, replication has become a real problem because no one, how to put this? Funding agencies always want to fund new and innovative research. Nobody wants, like, let's just say you were applying to SSHRC and you were like, or NSERC or NIHS, and you were like, I would like to replicate all of these other studies to test them. No one's ever going to fund that research because it's like, I'm sorry, you want to do what someone else already did? We want new and interesting research. So there's a funding crisis in replication as well. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. But yeah, replicability, like what is the chance that someone, if they did the same thing you just did, would get similar results or the same results? And is your methodology spelled out, or procedure in doing things spelled out in such a way as to make it basically replicable? Okay, yeah, the lab experiment. So we talked about lab experiments, but let's do this really quickly because I don't want to talk too much more about lab experiments. Yeah, you have a ton of control over the environment. You can assign participants randomly to either your control or your testing group. The limitations, right, low external validity, right? Because if you're in a lab setting, it's going to be hard to, generalize things out. Okay. Talk very quickly about quasi-experiments. Yeah, quasi-experiments, sometimes called natural experiments, right? And this can be like, instead of doing a lab experiment, trying to put people, so different from a true experiment in that internal validity is hard to establish, right? Because you don't control all the conditions and you probably don't control participants, right? You're not going to be able to do things like assign people to a random or a testing or a control group. Natural experiments are probably, if you're going to end up doing an experiment in sociology, and please don't write a question to do one of these because no, I don't want to see them on the assignments. But yeah, like a quasi-experiment or a natural experiment basically is like, okay, we're going to put something out in the real world and we're going to see how people react to it. So I talked last time, right, about things like, the violinist, the subway violinist experiment, right, where they have in the same subway station, they'll put at different times, they'll put a concert violinist dressed as a homeless person and a concert violinist dressed in like a tuxedo, and see how people react to him or her in that environment. Right, so basically doing this kind of natural experiment, seeing how people kind of react. Now, of course, right, you can like observe people, kind of make notes about how they reacted, but it's hard to do things like assign, a control group versus a test group, right? And to have a kind of true control is really difficult. Also, like, so it's experiment-like conditions, right? Because you're changing a variable. But it's hard to kind of figure out what's going on, right? What's the causation, right? How would you know what is causing, people to act in a certain way? Was it the person, the concert violinist, dressed as a homeless person, or that they were busy going to work that day, so it meant that they kind of brushed by the person? It'd be hard to control the conditions. So natural experiments, don't always tell you as much as you'd want them to. And there's been a ton of these done, over time, and some of there's lots of these that you can find them on YouTube. Things like the piano key stairs, right, to see how people would react to if you put basically piano keys on stairs, like big plastic ones, and you played notes as people walked up them. Would that make people stop? But again, it's hard to control the conditions. Maybe that lady that just like pounded up the stairs in a super big hurry at the subway station, maybe she was late for a doctor's appointment, and you can't ever really know that. So it's hard to, draw clear causation, right? You could say that, I don't know, middle-aged white guys aren't interested in musical stairs. But maybe I was just in a real hurry that day because there was no parking in Windsor or something, right? So that's the kind of limits on quasi experiments. Okay, cross-sectional designs, and then I think longitudinal is the next one. How am I doing for time? That clock is fast, so it's noon? Okay, perfect. Huh. My dad wants to talk to me. Maybe they're finally going to give me my inheritance. No, I'm kidding. Or write me out of the will. Okay. Could go either way. It's a Thursday. Cross-sectional design. Basically, a cross-sectional design is about taking essentially a snapshot in time, right? So you don't generally have a before and after comparison, right? So let's say like you're doing, I think questionnaires, right? A lot of questionnaires are going to be basically cross-sectional. In that, right, I'll talk about longitudinal in a sec, but let's say you wanted to get a kind of take on the student population at U of A and how they feel about taking transit to campus, right? You would be doing basically a cross-sectional kind of study, right? So you could talk to people coming out of, the buses and LRT, or you could send out a survey to students and try and get them, basically to answer your survey, right? But you're taking essentially a snapshot in time, right? It would be applicable particularly to that one moment, right? So you would be saying, in September of 2023, we did this survey, and at that moment, this is how students were feeling, about this particular thing. So yeah, I mean, they do not include a manipulation of the independent variable, no treatment, right? So it's not like an experiment where you're putting in a variable, you're just taking a snapshot. Questionnaires, structured interviews, structured observation are all this kind of design. Now, you can have, longitudinal surveys as well, where you follow people over time. But typically, like a lot of research that you're doing in terms of questionnaires are cross-sectional. You're measuring two or more variables in order to detect patterns of association. And when you get into the analysis of them, you basically will treat something typically as an independent variable in your kind of way of running the statistics, but you're not giving a treatment in the same way as you would in, say, a lab experiment. Always this. I'm sure you've heard this in before. Correlation does not equal causation. So you might find a correlation between two variables, right? So you put it through something like Pearson's R, and you say, okay, there's a correlation between, Why did you shut down? The projector randomly shut down. That's fun. It doesn't even have a timer on it. It's just an on-off. It must have an automatic on-off. Okay, I'll fix it. This one. Why do smartboards take an hour or a minute to power down? I don't understand. Okay, slides will be back in a sec. Didn't realize I had to add time to this one. I never have. Correlation not equaling causation, right? You can have two variables that sort of move together, right? So you might say that, the year of attendance, right? So whatever year that the student is in, first, second, third, fourth, or beyond 4, the less likely they are to want to take transit. Like their attitude towards transit might be more negative as they move through their university degree. So you can say that there is a correlation between year of study and negative attitudes about the LRT. Now, you can't definitively say typically that the number of years someone's been on campus is like the cause of their negative attitude about transit, right? It might be simply that transit has become more violent, or they're busier because they ran out of money in year 3 and therefore they have to work, so taking transit kind of stinks because it's slow, or this kind of thing, right? There might be other things causing it, but you can say there's a linkage between these two variables, and that's sort of the most you can ever say. Okay, we're back. Turn my mic back on. All right. Too loud. I'm sorry for being such a random human being. Also not sorry. Okay, does that all make sense? Correlation, causation. Does it make sense? Okay, good. Now you look bored, so I'm sure everything's making sense now. I'm teasing. I'm sorry. Okay, so cross-sectional designs. Yeah, I mean, there can be issues with internal validity, particularly establishing the direction of causation sometimes in cross-sectional designs, right? So, is it the example I gave a second ago was not a great one for direction of causation, but right, like which factor is affecting which, right? In which direction does the causation move, right? So, I'm trying to think of an example here, and I'm blanking on it for whatever reason. Like say you have a correlation between two variables. Let's say, let me try and think of one. Gender and negative attitudes towards dating apps, right? Oh no, that's a bad example. See, I'm having trouble with this one. Coming up with one on the fly. I'm usually pretty good at it. Let's just say I can't think of an example at the moment. I'll see if I can think of one for next class. But yeah, I mean, basically you might find it, positive self-esteem and income. Is that a good example? See, I wrote one down. I should have gone with that. Positive self-esteem and income. Okay, does positive self-esteem lead to someone applying for, that's a good example, higher income jobs and therefore getting higher income, right? Like, you were raised by super affirming parents who told you how wonderful you were. You have super great self-esteem. So when that job that you're barely qualified for comes up, you're like, I'm going for it. And you get it. And then you end up, moving up the income stream. And it's like, wow, positive self-esteem, increased income. Or is it the other way around? Did higher income, it's like, I feel wonderful about myself because I drive a BMW, because I can afford it, because I make lots of money, right? The direction there can be a little bit backwards, right? It's hard to know which is affecting which. Did the positive self-esteem help someone land a job that got them more income, or are they more confident in negotiating? You might have trouble in measuring that because let's say in your cross-sectional analysis, you're like, okay, like you have some kind of scale, right? So you ask a bunch of questions that are related to positive self-esteem, right? Maybe you have 15 questions on a survey that are all ways of measuring positive self-esteem. And then you ask about income and you find that, wow, those people that have self-esteem have higher income. But which direction did it go, right? It can be hard to know in say, like, especially a questionnaire. Because, unless you actually go and then, hang out with the people and kind of talk about their lives, how they got that high self-esteem or how they got that high income, you might not know which direction that flows in. Now, this can all be remediated by doing a multiple method study and using some qualitative methods to sort of figure that out. But, that's sort of the limit. Okay. Is there reciprocal causation? Would you have potentially either a vicious or virtuous cycle? Right? So low self-esteem causes someone to have lower income, which causes their self-esteem to drop, which causes their income to decline even more. Or, positive self-esteem. Positive self-esteem causes someone to apply for higher income jobs, which causes them to get more income, which causes their self-esteem to rise, which causes them to ask for a raise, which causes their, you can have these kind of multiple kind of directional, or what you would call either a virtuous or vicious cycle between two variables, right? Where one might actually be causing the other, which then worsens so it keeps going around and round. So it looks more like a circle. And that is hard to establish in cross-sectional design because you're only getting a snapshot, right? Just like taking a picture, you only see what's in the picture. You don't see any of the surrounding contexts. Okay. I thought I redesigned this one to make it easier to see. Maybe I didn't hit save. Okay, so there could also be problems with external validity, right? At the end of the day, a single snapshot in time, can you extrapolate that very broadly or to other contexts, not necessarily. To have external validity, a random method is used to select participants for the study, right? So, I mean, definitely, external validity goes up, say, if you randomly assign subjects, say, in a lab experiment, or when you get to, say, how you select participants for a survey, if it's done in a relatively random way, right? And there's ways of randomizing depending on your ability to do so. It's not always anyway. Don't overcomplicate, Broussard. There are ways when we talk about probability sampling. Talk about the ways that you can get random samples in in questionnaires, especially. But yeah, if you can get a random sample or as close to as possible, that increases external validity. If you're not able to do that, sometimes you might oversample particular groups, and that can result in less external validity. If random methods aren't used, it might hold only your study might only hold for the people that you actually studied, and not for a broader group. And again, this is all like when we get to probability sampling, we'll talk about that. It's not impossible to get a random sample when it comes to surveys. Okay, I think this is our last one for cross-sectional design. Cross-sectional designs, a strength. They can be examined. You can examine it can examine the effects of a variable that can't be manipulated in experiments, right? So you can measure the relationship between income and self-esteem, right? You're getting just a snapshot. You're getting a real-world look at how people are. And so, you're getting, you're not manipulating a variable, but you can get a look at the correlation between variables. Age, gender, ethnicity, culture, social class, right? You can measure how they're related to other things, right? And this is the bulk of survey research, right? You're doing things like doing a cross-sectional study and then saying like, okay, how is self-esteem affected by age? How is happiness affected by age? How is happiness affected by sex, by marital status, by ethnicity, like all of these things, right? You can do that in cross-sectional studies. And, we do a ton of this, and it's all very interesting in sociology. Feeling okay? All right. Let's, the data rectangle in cross-sectional research. This is like, if you were doing principally like experimental or like participant observation, you could use something like a chart like this. But anyway, let's not, because I'm behind on my stuff. Let's not worry about it too much, because I want to get through or at least talk about longitudinal a little bit. Okay, right. So in longitudinal studies, and you can have this in multiple different kinds of scenarios, right? You can certainly do survey work that's longitudinal. You can do qualitative work that's longitudinal, right? If you're interviewing people, you can re-interview them years later or at different times and see how things have changed over time. You can do lab experiments that are longitudinal. Like you can try bringing in the same person and doing the experiment, when they're 2 years old, when they're 10 years old, when they're 22 years old or whatever, right? It is hard, but nevertheless. Yeah, and I mean, basically, so all you need for a study to be longitudinal is that you're dealing with the same subjects, right? At time 1, at time 2, and time 3, right? Or more, right? So you're dealing with the same like case or the same subject, like person at different times, right? And yeah, basically designed to provide information about time order of changes in certain variables. Like my favorite longitudinal study, and if you've had any classes with me, you'll have heard about it, was the National Study of Youth and Religion that they did in the US, where basically they followed teenagers from the time they were between 13 and 18, and they followed them and re-interviewed them at 4-year intervals, basically for 15 years, right? To kind of see what the progression of their kind of religious and spiritual lives were over that time, right? So they in that case, they both resurveyed them. They did a survey with them, and then they interviewed a subsection of the people. So they tried to re-interview the same people and survey the same people over this kind of long period, right? So it's good for establishing the direction of causation, right? Like how are these things related? Because you can track the same, say, individuals over time. And I think I was talking about Harvey Cron, and they did a study that they started like in the 70s of people in Edmonton, and they've been re-interviewing them every like 5 years since the 1970s. And this is a longitudinal design, right? Or no, that they're surveying them. Sorry, those were surveys. But yeah, so yeah, for example, if an increase in income is observed at time 1 and an increase in life satisfaction happens at time 2, there's evidence that the increase in life satisfaction was preceded by income. Okay, so I've said, I've given you these long time frameworks. Longitudinal designs, I know it says long in it, but the time span can also be relatively short, right? The study that my boss is working on right now is a longitudinal study that's going to look at people basically who are incarcerated and then are released, and they're going to like survey them while they're incarcerated 2 weeks after release and then 2 months after release to see where their lives are at, right? That's a relatively short time span, but it's still longitudinal in the sense that it's measuring at different time kind of stamps, right? So it has a T1 incarcerated, T2 2 weeks post-release, T3 2 months post-release, right? So all of that is, that's all longitudinal. How are we doing? I hear people packing up, but I still have 5 minutes, so I got a few more minutes. Okay, 2 basic types, right? Your panel study, same people, households, organizations, etc. are studied at different times, right? So that's kind of what I was describing with the National Study of Youth and Religion, right? It's like you follow the same people. That's a panel study. A cohort study, people sharing the same experience are studied at different times, but different people may be studied. So, right, you might survey, I don't know, millennials or people born in 1981, right? And you might ask do a survey of people born in 1981 and do it at time 1, right? You do it when they're 18, you do it when they're 19, you do it when they're 20 to see if there are any changes over time, right? I guess if you were born in 1981, you weren't 20 recently, let's say, 40-ish. So that's a cohort study, but you're not necessarily interviewing the same people or surveying the same people, just anyone within that range, right? The most common one here is generational cohorts, right? We think of people as belonging to either like the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, or Gen Z. So you might do, the same kind of questionnaire sent out to, baby boomers at different time intervals to measure, what's happening in their lives. It's a little bit less robust in the sense that you're not getting the same people, so you can't control for as many factors, and you don't have as kind of consistent picture of their life. But it's easier, right? It's a lot easier than following up with people. So born in 1990 at 3 different times, 2000, 2010, and 2020, but use different subjects every time. Okay. I'm not going to get through. I'm going to do the last one in longitudinal design if I have time. I do, and then I will let you go. Okay, so longitudinal design, the drawbacks are kind of obvious, right? You have attrition, right? You lose people over time, especially in a panel study, right? In a panel study, a bunch of things happen. You lose, like people just drop out of the study. Either they don't want to do it anymore, or you can't find them, right? Or they die. Those are all things that happen, right? So, like, this happened, I know, in National Study of Youth and Religion, right? The initial kind of survey wave was over 3,000 people. By the time they got to the 4th wave, it was down to about 2,100. So they'd lost, 900 people that they couldn't resurvey, principally because they died, they refused to participate in follow-up studies, and the most common one, they simply lost track of them, right? People move around, they don't leave forwarding addresses, they change especially now with cell phones, they change their cell phone numbers really quickly. They don't know, or you're not able to find them through their phone numbers, right? Maybe the contacts that you had for them, their parents or relatives or, wife died or they got divorced and that person no longer has contact information for them, right? Lots of reasons that people fall out. So there's attrition over time or mortality in these panels. Figuring out when you should do the follow-up waves can be difficult. It's not the biggest challenge, right? You just kind of figure it out when you're setting up the experiment. Is it the right interval? Who knows? But you can kind of figure that out at the end of the project, I think. And then panel conditionings, yeah, people's attitudes and behaviors can change as a result of participating in the panel. That's not super common. I don't think that's the biggest problem in the world, but it can happen. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about case studies next time because that is more slides than we can do in a minute and a half. So let's leave it there for today. Reminder. First lab, mini lab, midnight, Sunday. Not an absolute hard deadline, right? So if it's like, don't email me if you submit it 10 minutes or even an hour after. As long as it's there when I wake up on Monday morning, that's fine. And even, if it's going to be later than that, just email me and let me know so I can sort of make accommodations there. All right, we'll see you. Have a great weekend. And we'll see you on Tuesday.
Hi, I had a couple of questions about my mini lab. So this was the question that I was kind of wanting to do, but we were talking in our lab on Tuesday, and she was talking about making it too narrow or whatever. And one of the examples that she gave me was like, what factors affect sleep quality? So if I use the word smartphone specifically to see what affects sleep quality, is that too narrow of a subject?
I mean,